Hello YouTube, I'm Pilot Stud and today I'm doing a much requested video. Now after Sim Update 5, so many of us had the capability to change our settings. And while the update did reduce the beauty of the simulator in some cases, it allowed me the opportunity to increase many of my settings to hopefully make it look even better than it did before. Today I'll be sharing with you my settings, letting you decide whether or not you like them, and of course allowing you to copy my settings to hopefully improve your Microsoft Flight Simulator experience. Of course, it's not one size fits all, and a lot of it is personal preference, so share your settings down below. There will be a FPS test at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that, and if you like my content, be sure to like, comment and subscribe. But now, let's get into the settings and into this video. So here we are in the cockpit of the 787. I selected this aircraft because it normally is the most FPS intensive. We're just going to go up to our debug menu, dev mode menu, and put display FPS on. Here you can see inside the cockpit we're getting a pretty stable 37 FPS. Of course, bear in mind this is at London Heathrow with live traffic on in the 787. That means it's by far the most, probably one of the more intense areas to be on. But you can try it out at Charles de Gaulle, JFK, airports like that, areas like that, because of course we're quite close to the city of London. This is going to be one of the more FPS intensive areas. But as you can see, with the exception of a few loading in stutters, it's pretty stable and certainly playable, and of course these settings are adjustable to what you like, but of course it's what I like, so that's why I'm showcasing it. Let's hop into settings now. So here we are in settings. As you can see, I like to keep my display mode on windowed. That's just because it makes it easier to go on other applications and it doesn't seem to have an impact on FPS anyway. Full screen resolution of course matches up to the monitor. Makes complete sense. And render scaling. Now render scaling is something that I didn't actually used to increase, but it does make a big difference graphically at the expense of performance. I've got mine set to 120. Which means I get a rendering resolution of around 2300 times 1200, which is a bit more than my monitor. I just find it brings out the definition of the ground textures a bit more and makes it look a bit nicer. Now, to be honest, I'm happy at 100, but if you want to improve your graphics, 120 to 150 will do you well. Of course, my specs are in the description, and I should have talked about them already. I'll talk about them now. I've got an RX 5600 XT, which is a mid-range graphics card. I've got a Ryzen 5 3600 CPU, which is a pretty capable mid-range CPU. I've got 32GB of DDR4 RAM, which is quite important, and RAM is probably going to be the deal breaker here. My GPU's pretty average, so is my CPU, but my RAM is higher than average, and it does mean it allows me to raise my settings quite high up. Although recently after Sim Update 5, RAM has been less important, it's still a pretty key player. So there we go, my setup is pretty mid-range. I've got two monitors, so of course my FPS isn't as high as it could be. If I wasn't recording and talking to a microphone, I'd probably gain a few more FPS, but anyway, is what it is. But yes, a mid-range setup, hence the title of this video. Going back to the settings, 120 for render scaling will do you well, but if you want a bit more performance, if you want a bit more FPS, if you're aiming for 60 FPS, then take it down to 100 and job's a good one. Also, if you want to improve your graphics at the expense of a few FPS, although I wouldn't recommend it, you can raise it all the way up to around 180, 200 in some cases. Render scaling doesn't have as big of an impact as it used to have, and you certainly can get all the way up there, but I'd just be cautious with it. If you are having FPS issues, it's probably the first setting you want to lower. Moving down, VSync. VSync I set to on is because my graphics card control panel VSync isn't the greatest, so recently I've kept VSync on. Of course it doesn't have a massive FPS hit, but it does have a big kind of graphical hit. If you've got VSync off and your in-house graphics card system VSync isn't the best, then you will notice a lot of screen splitting and it looks really ugly, especially when you're moving the camera around. Frame rate limit is 60 FPS, although realistically I could go down to 30 seeing as we're only at 40 now, but bearing in mind this is the most FPS intensive situation going on behind us, it's probably okay to have it at 60. Global rendering quality, of course custom because we're not using a preset. Now let's move down into the bulk of the settings. So I'm going to leave them all here just so you guys can read through them and probably adjust them right now. You can see anti-aliasing set to TAA. You really want this on. It's the only one that looks pretty good, and while they do say it does have a big FPS or performance hit, I really don't think it does. All it does have is a big graphical hit. Of course, if you've got a low range system, it may be a different story, but this is just my story. Terrain level of detail, now this is once again really kind of what flying you do. If you're not too worried about how the ground looks when you're flying high up in the sky, then you can probably put this lower to around even 90, 80, and you'll still have pretty good ground textures, or terrain textures I should say. But seeing as I do a bit of VFR flying, and of course low airways IFR flying, I do like to keep this as high as I can, and this does have a pretty big FPS hit, so this is where I compensate really. I prefer to have better graphics at this point compared to more FPS, but of course you can set it down to 100 if you want. But 140 seems to do the trick pretty well. In addition, terrain vector data doesn't have a massive FPS hit either, it just injects the quality of lakes, rivers and roads, so unless you're flying in a really densely roaded area or area with plenty of rivers, it doesn't have much of an impact, so put it on high if you can. Buildings again used to have a big impact before Sim Update 5, but I've got to be honest, anywhere between medium to ultra should do you well. They don't look too different. At times it might just add an extra air conditioning unit on top of your building, stick it to high. Trees, medium. Trees do seem to still have a pretty big FPS input, which is why I've set it down to medium. If you do care about the quality of your trees, do not fear, there's not much difference between medium and ultra in my opinion. Same applies with grass and bushes. If I'm getting some cool screenshots, I might put it up to ultra, but realistically, you don't need it. Objects level of detail, well we're at 140, again kind of the same as level of detail. It only really has a big FPS impact if you're going with the extremes on a low spec computer, but aside from that, set it anywhere between 90 to 150. Personal preference really, is I like to keep it kind of mid-range 140. Now volumetric clouds is where I compensate again. Of course, clouds are nowhere near as good as they were before Sim Update 5, which is why I put them all the way up to ultra to try and make them look as good as possible. Texture resolution has a massive FPS impact for me, and if I put that up to ultra I might lose up to 10 FPS. So I do recommend you proceed with caution with this setting. I keep it at high and it seems to do a pretty good job there. And of course my sim looks pretty good. Moving down all of the next settings, let's go with the default high preset. So if you go to global rendering quality and set it to high, we basically got all the same ones here. Going all the way down to contact shadows, I'll then talk about the other ones down below. Starting off with anisotrophic filtering, I keep it at 8 times, and then textless super sampling 4x4, textless synthesis high, and water waves high. Now these do have a pretty big FPS impact together, so just leave them on the preset. You can leave them down at medium if you're not too concerned about your graphics, but I once again like to strike a fine balance in the middle and keep them at what the high preset is. Now moving down to shadows and shadow maps, yes, I leave these at high settings because shadows are really important for the general look of the sim. If you have them too low, then it makes the game look cartoony. Hey, did you see that National 747 just fly past us? That's pretty cool. We've got live traffic on. Anyway, what was I saying? Yes, shadows do have a massive impact on the graphics, so put them as high as you can, but they also do have a massive impact on FPS. So once again, striking the balance, I go for high settings, but just remember these do have a big FPS impact. Same with contact shadows, I keep it at high. Moving down to the last few settings now, windshield effects, I like to keep at ultra. I move this above the default high setting. It's because I really do like the windshield effects in Microsoft Flight Simulator. From the rainwater running down the aircraft, it just looks really good and really beautiful, so I like to keep it as ultra. Ambient occlusion, keep it at high. I don't find it makes a big difference anyway. Now reflections is an interesting one. Oh my goodness, we're getting a lot of planes landing behind us. Reflections, when I want to get a good screenshot, I might bump it up to ultra because reflections do look really beautiful when they're at that stage. But they do have a massive FPS impact, so I recommend you test around with reflections, because of course if you want the beautiful little instrument reflections in the cockpit, then you'll want to put that to ultra, but if you're not too phased, then you can probably put it down to medium. Light shafts are same kind of with reflections really, that's personal preference, same with bloom. Lens bloom kind of doesn't really impact FPS at all. Just turn it on if you want to make it look more realistic, in my opinion. Anyway, depth of field does have a somewhat minor FPS impact, but not noticeable enough to make me put it down to medium or low. So I keep it at high. Now motion blur does have a big FPS impact for me, and I think it makes the sim look quite ugly when you're looking around, so I turn that one off. Same with lens correction as well, it makes my instrument panels fuzzy when I'm in the cockpit, so turn that off as well. Lens flare, well that's personal preference. If you want flare on your lens, then keep it on, but if you don't, turn it off. A lot of these bottom settings are personal preference, and it is what it is really. Now glass cockpit refresh rate had a massive FPS impact. Before Sim Update 5, they seem to have fixed it, so medium is probably your best bet. High and ultra, well they do make it a bit too laggy in the cockpit for my liking. Or high, I should say, there's not ultra. But yes, if you put it down to low, I think it starts to degrade your experience, so I do recommend you leave it at medium. There's all my settings. I hope I've really helped you out here. Now let's go for a bit of a test. Apply and save. Of course, I've kept them all the same. Basically, if you want to save FPS, put your render scaling down first and then sort out your shadows. They're the things that really eat up my FPS, and then you're going to want to move to buildings, trees, grasses and bushes. If your FPS are too low, you want to lower these, and you can save quite a bit of FPS by swapping around with your level of detail. These settings strike a good balance between graphics and performance, I believe. Let's go test them out. So for today's test, I thought I'd bring you over New York. We're going to start out high in this fighter jet, which shows you how it would deal with high IFR airliners. And then of course we're going to come down. Now the really beautiful thing about the recent hotfix was how high photogrammetry loads in from. So coming over New York, we're already getting 50 FPS. I think that's very impressive, and it's already all loaded in. We're in the MB339er, which is a fantastic Italian training jet aircraft and light attack aircraft by India Fox Teco, and the fact it's almost all loaded in already is pretty impressive stuff. Now as we get down, please remind yourself that I'm filming on Streamlabs and using two monitors to do that, so we're losing about 5-10 FPS there to what I'm normally used to anyway. And just look at that, there's the Empire State Building right in front of us. Bit of loading in stutters there as you see, but we're all used to that anyway, and still hitting 40 FPS around New York, and it is super smooth. I mean, just look outside, it looks beautiful. I am impressed. I mean, we're basically hitting 50 FPS, at times 60 FPS if you remember that I'm filming with Streamlabs. It is really beautiful, and I'm so happy I can share these settings with you guys, because I really do think they work really well. Share your experiences down below, just a short little FPS test here. Of course we were at London Heathrow earlier as well, and that's in the 787, which is the more FPS intense aircraft. But of course the best thing about this aircraft is that you can go incredibly quick, which is incredibly important for when you're testing out performance and graphics settings. How quickly the sim can load it in and what stutters you get from that, and you can see it's pretty good. It's certainly flyable, and using this jet aircraft as a benchmark, even for some of the bigger airliners, you're going to get something around here. It might drop down to around 35 FPS in the airliners, just because of all the screens and systems you're running. But of course you're not normally going to get this low with them, so I think it's a pretty good benchmark. I hope these settings have helped you out, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments. These are my settings for 2021 for Microsoft Flight Simulator after Sim Update 5. I hope I've gone into enough detail, and if you've got anything you'd like me to clarify in the settings, then put your questions down in the comments and I'll try and reply to as many of them as I can. From me today, that is all. Thank you for watching, guys. Look at the aircraft carrier down there. Don't know why that's there. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Of course, Sim Update 5 I don't think looks as good as Sim Update 4 in some places. The performance has certainly increased, so I guess we've got something good from it anyway. From me today, that is all. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to my first class channel members, Simon Schmidt, Ethan Bubeck, Jesse Wiseman, Captain Matt Russell and Erwin K. If you would like to become a channel member for stuff like a shout out at the end of the video, then be sure to click that blue join button. It really does help me out. In addition to that, I'm running a charity fundraiser, ending with me doing a skydive. I'll be raising money for 2 incredible charities. Thank you to all the donations so far. The link for that is in the comments and the description. Anyway, from me today, that is all. Bye bye.